So we'll kick off the AMA. We have Ron on the call, and we got Phil as well. So without further ado, we have 3 questions on our backlog to talk through today, and those 3 questions are: what are the best practices for mocking provider dependencies? Second one is, can I test third-party APIs? And then the last one is, what's the difference between Spring Cloud Contract and Pact? So we'll have a crack at answering those questions today. Phil, if it's you on the call, if you have any questions, obviously please drop it in the chat channel. And anybody else that comes along obviously can do the same thing, and we'll happily answer any of those. Although I think at this point, Phil, you're probably qualified to answer all questions on this backlog today. Cool. All right. Well, we'll kick off with the first question, which is, what are the best practices for mocking provider dependencies? Did you want to have a go at that one, Wrong, or are you happy for me to try and answer that one?
Well, yeah, you can go, because my answer is that there's no best practice, right? It depends on circumstance.
Yeah. What do you tend
solution.
to do? Yeah.
It's not one solution that fits all.
No. What would you?
Depends on the mock tools you use, I guess.
Would you tend to, like, I suppose for me, I think there's sort of generally two general ways of doing the provider verifications. One is where you're doing it sort of within a unit testing framework, like JUnit or something. And then there's really a black box style version of that where you're testing from the outside. Are there any other types of provider verifications that you think of? Like, I think you can point it at a test environment, for example, which we think is probably the least preferable of those options. Then you obviously can run the thing locally, but pointing at sort of black box from the outside. Are there any options that you can think of that you've seen in the wild?
No, those are the two. So you're either going to mock out things in your code, in your actual tests, using, like in the JVM, you use Mockito, Ruby, and other languages, you'd use equivalent mechanisms. Or you'll need to, if you're running the actual app, then you need to have some way of using a mock server to provide those dependencies.
Yeah, no, that's a good point as well. Is do you mock it in memory using like stubbing tools or mocking tools, or do you mock it at the boundary of the actual system where it goes over the wire to another HTTP? Do you tend to use Docker for your databases? So I think we're talking about HTTP endpoints there, but there's also other dependencies, so things like databases or I guess queues and things like this. Again, I guess there's no general best practice here, but I guess what do you tend to use?
No, I don't run databases in Docker.
Yeah, a bit too slow. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and if I'm going to be mocking things out, I'll just do it in the unit tests. It's a lot easier.
Yeah, I tend to agree. And maybe just to paint the picture, I'll just share a window to go through that. What's going on here? Yeah, I certainly think it's much easier to deal with this kind of testing in a mocking context, in a unit test context. So I think we've talked about it before. Although Pact on the provider side isn't necessarily a unit test in terms of it's not testing a single function in the traditional sense. You kind of want to run it in a unit test context because you can get all these nice benefits. So on the provider side here, I'm just going to close this down for a second. This is a JavaScript or a node provider test. Probably could be cleaned up, but line 6 to 11 here, make it a bit bigger. This basically stands up the provider locally on port 8080, but because it's running it in a unit test context where we can use tools like stubbing tools or what have you, we've got a lot more flexibility with what we can do here. Now, the flip side is if you do too much manipulation with it, I think the downside is that you could potentially change your provider code in such a way that now you're making the test pass arbitrarily, and you're now actually changing the behavior of it so that it's not actually like what it's going to be in production. So that's the potential trade-off here if you do too much mocking and stubbing or behavior manipulation. But the upside is it's usually going to be much faster to run, I think. Those tests are going to run much faster, and they're going to be much more deterministic and reliable. The flip side, obviously, is running it in a black box style where you've got less flexibility in terms of how you're going to manipulate data and state, but you're going to get pretty close to what it's going to be running in real life. So I think that's the main trade-off. So in this case here, we're starting the provider locally. So it's kind of running it. It's actually physically running this provider code locally. And if we scroll down, the main thing down here in our states, so the main thing you normally need to manipulate is during state when I'm dealing with, in this case here, there's a few different states. One's where products exists and so exist. I think we've got a duplicate state here. So I'll just for clarity, I'm going to move that one. But you can see here, we can actually manipulate the repository that's attached to our controller here. And we can put in, in this case, it's an in-memory implementation of that repository that has the same interface as what it would in real life. So we don't need to actually deal with Docker or any real external databases. We can do this all in memory, which is much faster, obviously. So in this case here, when products exist, we add a product to the database. When no products exist, in this case, we just empty out the database. And that gives us a lot more flexibility. Obviously, if we're dealing with Docker or something, we would need to be calling repository methods to physically talk to that database to add or remove, things from that database. For example, if it's a database. Of course, it's not just databases. There's other things as well. Cool. So I'll just go back to this and stop sharing. Anything else to add on that, Ron?
No.
Okay. Cool. That's the first question. Now, just keep an eye on any questions there in the chat. Doesn't look like it for now, so we'll just move on to the next one. So can I test third-party APIs? So I guess we do get this question a bit in, you've got this system. So it's probably an extension of this first question, actually. We're stubbing out downstream systems. In the case of third-party APIs, in case of first-party APIs or APIs that are part of your ecosystem, you would then, anything you stub there, you're going to then create a Pact test for as well, right? We want to make sure we've got a Pact test there. So anything we're stubbing, we've now got good contract test coverage there as well. Otherwise, how do we know that that's the real behavior of those APIs? But of course, some of those downstream APIs aren't actually going to be owned by you. There might be a third party like GitHub or something, or some other SaaS product. So the question is, what do you do there? Do you use Pact for that, or do you do something else? So yeah, I'm keen on your thoughts as well, Ron, about some of the strategies you've employed before. I guess you've got one option is to use Pact, and one option is to not use Pact. And if you're not using Pact, what are the options? And if you are using Pact, then how does it work a bit differently? Because really, it's not designed for that. But yeah, so I guess I'm keen on some of your thoughts, Ron, and I'll add mine on top of that as well.
Well, I've used it in the past. So I've worked on a system that we had to integrate with Jira, and so whenever there was an error detected at runtime, then we just had to create a ticket in a Jira ticket. So, it's all tracked. So I used Pact just to make sure that I had configured the request to Jira correctly. Obviously, it's not going to be verified by anybody else. So it's only half of the, the validation. But it was helpful for me because it meant that the tests were the same as the other actual Pact tests in the application. And I got some confidence knowing that I could check the Pact file against the Jira docs and make sure that everything was correct. So,
yeah, and I suppose the other benefit as well is just that you're making what you're doing very clear as well. So I remember you saying early on that you did this contract testing thing, and while it was designed for sort of developers, that the tester on the team came and looked at the Pact broker and looked at all the Pacts and found it really helpful to actually understand what the system was actually doing, and sort of reverse engineering the code from the outside. So I suppose you're going to get that benefit as well. And the diagram view is going to give you a visibility of those systems you're communicating to, even though they're not actually you're not actually verifying that. Yeah, I mean, just extending that answer, I've certainly done this before with third-party APIs that I don't manage. I think the reason I first added the proxy layer into Node Pact.js was because I needed to manipulate a few things like the request filter style that you've added to JVM. And I won't go into the nastiness of why I did that and what I had to do with that layer. But the reason was we didn't quite trust this API. It wasn't an internal API, but it wasn't external. It was kind of this quasi. The way that the API was managed was like through a partner that was kind of part of the same company, but it's for all intents and purposes they were a separate team and they weren't going to do contract testing with us. So we used it to make the expectations really clear on what we were doing with their APIs. And when their APIs changed, we could actually detect that. So it was probably a bit of a use case we wouldn't necessarily is supported, but we ran a job pretty regularly that would just rerun that verification kind of on a regular schedule and would pick up any drift between their API and what we needed to do. And that really helped facilitate conversations. Obviously, that's not the best way of doing things, but it did actually work. And it works in the kinds of way when you I guess that kind of testing works pretty well if you're not dealing with state changes. So if you're not having to mutate a state, that kind of testing actually works just fine. If you're having to like create things or mutate state, obviously that's very hard to do if you're doing it to a real system, because you don't want to be creating Jira tickets and then cleaning up those Jira tickets afterwards, for example. So if you're not using Pact, so in your case, Ron, you're using Pact to essentially document your usage of that third-party API. What do you do on top of that? So obviously the third-party API isn't going to verify that contract. What do you fall back to give you the confidence that that third-party API is still going to be stable? Is it more that you just trust that as a like a Jira, like an enterprise public API, that they're just going to follow backwards compatibility and Semver and things like this?
Yeah, Jira's they're not gonna change the APIs drastically at all. Atlassian's a big company and the APIs are really important. So yeah, I don't have any issue with that.
So you probably think of it from a risk perspective, going, okay, well, Atlassian and GitHub and things like this, they're not going to change their APIs. But what if you're dealing with maybe a new incumbent or something that's just building this out? Do you still have that level of trust? Would you put something in to test that, or would you still work with the assumption that their APIs are going to work as is? And if it doesn't, obviously you build protections in on the API client to deal with those error scenarios.
Yeah, I haven't worked with that in that scenario, so I've never had that issue.
Yeah, I think the extension of this same scenario, I think, is where you've got essentially internal teams that yes, they're an internal API to your company, but they're refusing to do Pact tests, or they're not there yet. So you've written Pact tests for another API team within the company, and for whatever reason they haven't got the verifications going, but that they're basically, as far as you're concerned, an external API. Do you have the same level of trust in that situation, Ron?
Yeah, probably not.
Yeah. And we know what those companies generally fall back to. That's where they go back to end-to-end tests and things like this. So Phil's just had a comment. I'm just going to read it out loud. Read it first before I read it out loud. Cool. So I have an application that consumes and serves APIs for other internal applications. These scenarios are a great use case for Pact. However, our main solution is a public API, which Pact might be the best solution for. What would you recommend? What would your recommendation be? Would that be mixing and matching contract testing tools, e.g. Pact for internal, Spring Cloud Contract for public? Just worry about the internal system, since we can't really control what external consumers would use, i.e. is it not worth the effort and overhead? Okay, so I'm just wrapping my head around that. So your main sorry, go on, Ron.
So a solution that has kind of been proposed in this particular case is to create an example consumer. So you're not going to obviously test all your consumers against your public API, but maybe you create a example consumer and you can actually use that to verify with. So it becomes an example to everyone else who's going to be using your API, and then you know that your tests are verified with that one.
Yeah,
I think we've had a similar idea. So there's an open banking initiative in Australia where they want to move all the banks to an open API where it's standardized. And there's an idea there of something like where you would create a example use of the API with possibly using like something like Pact. And that becomes like what they used to have in the old days were called TCKs, like you had your test kits, software compatibility kits that you would publish, and then people could use that to verify, they're working correctly against the APIs. I think that's kind of the idea.
Yeah, I like that. And the other thing you could do is basically, if you make that open, others could actually contribute their specific, request into that one repository as opposed to creating their own one. So you could imagine that being like a public example that can be continually evolved into, that becomes the sort of the gold standard, I suppose, of all the things it can do. Yeah. And I guess there's also, in your case, I'm not sure if you're using Open API spec or things like that, but there are tools that will give you some extra assurances that you're compatible with the Open API spec that you're publishing. So there's tools in that ecosystem as well, and obviously Pactflow, we're doing some work in that space as well to try and give you some confidence that your consumers are compatible with that that API that publishes an Open API spec. But yeah, I love the TCK. Geez, I remember early on in my career that terminology, but I hadn't come across it for a long time. But I guess there's a lot of old ideas are actually very good, right? And that actually seems like a really good one.
Yeah, I think it stands for Test Compatibility Kit.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah, I love it. It's a great idea.
Yeah, the other example is the UK Gov Digital Services, where they were using Pact, and then for their public APIs, they actually published. They had an open Pact broker that was, I think, read only, and they published their Pacts there. So no one is going to verify the Pacts, but they were there just as documentation, I think, for anyone who did want to use them. So that's like another example where it was there just to be in the open and published documentation.
Yeah, and the other one with that one, before I get to Phil's second point, was when Beth was talking at Yao in Melbourne in 2017. One of her slides in her talk, she mentions how Pact isn't a good solution for public APIs. And at the end of the talk, somebody who works for Seek, which is Australia's largest jobs classifieds website, put their hand up and said, actually, we're using it for that exact use case she said it was bad for. And it's exactly what you talked about, Ron. They basically have a Pact broker that they have that was publicly available, that obviously was read only, and they published the contracts to that. What they were doing was they were integrating with an external partner. In this case, I think there was going to be multiple partners, but the first one I think was one of their strategic partners. And yeah, they used the Pact broker for that use case, and apparently it worked well for them as well, which is quite interesting. So Phil, said, I've read almost zero about the bidirectional contract so far. Will that eventually come to the open source Pact broker? Probably not. Probably not, Phil. So basically, in fact, if you haven't read it already, we published an article the other day called, I guess, Why Build an Open Source Company, which kind of talks about some of those thoughts. In at least in the short term, we've got to find a way of differentiating and creating value over and above the open source solution. Otherwise, people won't give us money, and if people don't give us money, we can't keep working, and we've got to go find other jobs. So, at the moment, we're building some differentiation between the open source tool and the Pactflow. But the general delineation between what goes into Pactflow and what goes into the open source tool is anything's really to do with Pact itself. So Pact the tool. So we talk about things like gRPC, protobufs, plugins, and things. That's all going to go into the open source ecosystem, and it's not going to be commercialized. Where we're building, different types of contract testing workflows that aren't Pact specific, or things that are more designed for enterprises at scale. So user management, things like this, that goes into the commercial one. So that's the general gist. Yeah, thanks, Phil.
But the open source broker is not really restricted just to Pacts, though. You can publish any contract to it. Yeah. I think what we're working on is the workflow around, using other types of contracts. So it's not that you can't use them with the Pact broker. It's like the other tooling. We're creating tooling around it to try make it easier to use, I guess, would be the answer there.
Yeah, it's a really when I said it to Beth's like, yeah, it can take anything. I think at the moment it still needs to be JSON formatted, but you can upload any JSON formatted file to the Pact broker and it won't validate it. It just takes it. So for example, you could just put a JSON document in there with a base 64 encoded payload that has anything you want, and it will just accept it as a contract. It doesn't actually know about Pact, believe it or not, even though it's called the Pact broker. it really should just be called a contract broker or just, some file broker, because it doesn't actually think too much about it. Now, Arthur, we've got Arthur on the call as well. I'm not sure if you're just here to listen or if you've got any questions, but feel free to either raise your hand and ask a question or drop it in our chat on the side there. Feel free to ask whatever you need. Otherwise, we will get to the third question, which is what's the difference between Spring Cloud Contract and Pact? So I might get the docs open for this one because we do have an article on that. And it probably does need to be updated because I think somebody recently was doing some research into this space and came back with some extra feedback around the differences. But I'll point to it now. Introduction. There we go. Okay, so a lot of these things, I think, cloud contracts. So we have a lot of sort of other comparisons with other tools, Q&A and convince me type things. So a lot of these questions do come up there. We do have a bit of work to, I guess, keep them up to date. But what's the difference between Pact and Spring Cloud Contract? But we'll start from the summary at the bottom and we can work our way back. So
that text is really small.
Oh, thanks, Ron. Is that better?
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. So that kind of sums it up, I think, at the end, and we can work backwards from that. The first thing is that Pact, if you're tied to JVM and Spring Cloud Contract might be easy for you to integrate with because it literally, is only designed for that kind of ecosystem, or it was designed from that kind of ecosystem. Although I know this answer might be slightly out of date because I know there's a lot of Spring extensions in the JVM now, which feel free to chip in, Ron. Spring Cloud Contract does have a bit of a provider-driven angle to it. So you can sort of choose to be provider or consumer-driven. From what I've seen, the workflow does seem to be more naturally provider-driven than consumer-driven, but it does support consumer-driven contracts and tries to implement that model. The way it works is you need to submit a pull request essentially in to the provider's code base. So it's kind of dependent on using Git or tools like Git, where you actually submit your contract. Now, the issue there is you can submit that contract by hand, or you can try to generate it somehow. And obviously, the fact that you generate by hand does mean that there's a chance of drift. That is a bit of a difference between those tools. But yeah, so it does have a provider-driven kind of angle to it, which might be helpful in some of those cases. Pact, by default, is it has a specification which is language agnostic, and that is what drives the interoperability between all the different language bindings. So you can do, contract testing with a web front end in React.js or in Angular or whatever, and you can have a backend in Ruby and Java and Golang, and they'll all be able to communicate the same intent through the contract. So that's one of the main things about Pact is it has these language bindings. Of course, that does create effort for us, but I think it's worth the value in terms of, I guess, the feedback we get. So it does work well across languages in a polyglot kind of environment. So that's one big difference. You can do contract testing with Spring Cloud Contract across languages, but you still need to use, I think it's a Groovy file to define the contract. And it's a bit more cumbersome to do that, in my opinion, but you definitely can do it. And lastly, obviously, Pact and its tooling is all integrated in with the Pact broker, and then obviously Pactflow. Although, what's the gentleman's name? I just forgot his name. Just gone blank on the author of Spring Cloud Contract's name. But anyway, he did some great work a few years back, and did some integration work in the Spring Cloud Contract side, where you can actually upload contracts to Pact broker and pull them down, and he basically converts the Spring Cloud Contract stub files or mock files into a Pact file and reverses it back out. I don't think it supports Spec 3, and it almost certainly won't implement Spec 4. Yeah, Groovy or YAML. Thanks, Phil. Yeah, so they're probably the main big differences. There's a bunch of sort of philosophical differences, I think, at lower levels, but that probably sums up the main top level ones. Oh, and so one thing that somebody in our forums recently was digging into was the concept of provider states. There's probably going to be heaps of little things in terms of matches and how we do that are going to differ between languages. But the provider states one, I think, is quite a fascinating one because that is really critical to the way Pact does contract testing, and it can be a complicated thing to get. But once you get it, it's really the hook that gets you out of the data fixture problem you've got with end-to-end tests. And to my knowledge, Spring Cloud Contract doesn't have that kind of feature where you can annotate the state that goes with a particular request to implement that on the other side. It sounds like Phil's got some more knowledge on that as well. So feel free to chip in if you've got any other points there, Phil. Ron, was there anything else on that I guess, in terms of differences?
No, I've never really looked at Spring Cloud contracts. No.
Yeah, I think Phil's just confirmed the provider states thing as well. So yeah, with Spring Cloud Contract, you can define the contract as Groovy or YAML. So you got that flexibility. That's right. The YAML is for probably what you prefer to do if you're not using, JVM codebase, I assume. Cool. I'll just go back. Phil had another question before. Another question that comes up often is nullable fields. Yeah, standard advice is to have multiple contracts for null or non-null values. How do you handle large payloads with nullable fields? Is it just a matter of being intuitive and picking and choosing the important ones? It's a good question. That actually we're going to talk in the next AMA, but you've asked it here, so we'll answer it here obviously as well. Did you want to have a crack at that one, Ron? You might be able to.
Yeah. So the big problem is a lot of people treat contracts like schemas, where schemas you can define it can be a value or null. The big problem we have is that say you say, okay, let's do and the spec v3 supports an OR. So let's say this value can be null or a formatted date, right? And then during your tests, you use null values everywhere. So of course the contract's all valid. You validate your provider side, it returns null values for those fields because of its particular data, and you say, okay, this contract's been verified. You got to deploy your app, and one day, one of the interactions has a non-null value, and it's not correctly formatted. The date format is incorrect, and you wouldn't have picked it up because it was using the one example. That's why we say you should use, multiple tests and test the different combinations so that you know that you have tested all the combinations of that. Because otherwise, you're asserting something against a contract, and you haven't actually verified all the different cases. But then, like you said, with very big payloads, that's now becomes quite a large task to, there's quite a big matrix of different combinations that you have to do there. So, yeah, I'm not sure how you would test, the large combinations. You might have to do some type of automation where maybe you can generate the tests for all the different combinations would be better, or maybe Pact is just not the right tool for that, where you need to use more traditional integration tests.
Yeah, I think so the first half of that question, obviously, yeah, I completely agree with, and I think I remember doing something similar. I think my first pull request or second pull request into the Ruby code base back in 2014-15, there was a min array like, and I was like, oh, I went and eventually traced it down to this thing. I was like, oh, it's got one there as the minimum. That's bad. And I put a pull request in, changed the tests, and then said, bang, there you go. Now I can do a min like 0. And then, I got this, as I at least mentally recall, a decent response as to why that was a bad thing to be doing. And it amounted to that exact argument. I was like, oh, okay, that actually makes a lot of sense. It's not intuitive at first. It's kind of frustrating. But to answer your question, so I think you've actually kind of nailed the one that I think we mostly often answer. Where possible, try and find the schema that's got the minimum amount of optional fields in it and the one with the most fields that are currently null. So basically try and find the one with the largest amount of values in it that you can support in the least. And then you sort of give yourself some confidence that you can do that. Because I guess inside a big payload, you might have different use cases of how you use that data. So it really does depend on how your client API is calling that endpoint. So if you've got one single client SDK that's always using the same big master endpoint with all the things, and it just returns back a domain model, then it may not matter so much that some of those fields are going to be different, at least in terms of the way your client marshals, unmarshals the data. But of course, from a functional perspective, that's a whole different story, and that probably should be tested, using your functional testing tools. But yeah, I think, to be honest, I think it's going to come down to a bit of an art form. I suppose you could do it, run set and generate those tests, but of course, on the provider side, the more if you're going to be generating large numbers of consumer tests to represent the various combinations, then that's going to have to get dealt with on the provider side at some point. So that's potentially where those sort of schema validation tools might come into it, where on the consumer side, you've generated lots of those expectations for all the permutations you need. But on the provider side, you're not actually verifying each permutation. You're just going to verify your API is compatible with that spec, and trust that there's enough other coverage around it that you're not going to actually break those sub scenarios where those optional fields aren't there. I mean, it's kind of a bit of a segue into the schema testing. I know we've just gone over time, but this is where the schema specs, so like things like OpenAPI spec or JSON schemas, still don't quite give you the value you want, because they're going to tell you they're optional, but unfortunately they won't tell you which specific requests are going to return back that response with fields that are optional or not. It just says these are the potential things that can come back, optionally or not, but you won't know in which scenarios they're always going to come back or not. And so any tool that then tests your provider with that schema will also just assume they can be null at any point in time. So there's no mapping of the exact inputs to outputs, and that's kind of what Pact gives you. But of course, when you want to do that, that's going to come at a cost of you're going to have to cover those tests. So you need to sort of use that art form. Hopefully that helps answer that question. Cool. Yeah, thanks, Phil. Okay, well, we've just gone over time, but I'm happy to hang around for a few more minutes if there's any more questions. Otherwise, we'll wrap it up there, and we'll see you at our next Ask Me Anything